Aha! We're live. It's Thursday. It's Crypto Arms Race Day, and we're back with another episode of Go FUD Yourself. JD Gagnon here, my good friend Kiara. What's going on?
It's Thursday, and it is my favorite day. So we got Mr. Producer to travel through Latin America for us.
Did he drive?
We are
walk?
I think
Hitchhike?
so. Well, I would assume that he flew his private helicopter about and asked people for their take on the news, as per any good TikToker.
That would make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
If he was out there in the Go FUD Yourself chopper.
Yeah. That's, I'm glad that we have something to aspire to.
Right. We'll get there someday.
We're going to talk about Argentina because their political campaign continues, but it's come to kind of a one-to-one head. So that's exciting. And then we're going to just talk about LATAM generally and how they are dealing with crypto, what they think about CBDCs, what kind of DEXs and dApps they're using, that sort of thing. I think it's kind of interesting. You'll definitely see that as de-dollarization, peso, etc. They love crypto. So that's kind of cool and exciting for us. And then we will also talk about El Salvador and how they've been failing to continue as the Bitcoin capital and what their constituents are going to do about it.
Yeah, it's exciting. That's a lot to cover in LATAM today. We're going to stay localized to one region.
Well, It's cold here. You're cold. I'm cold. So we're going to dream of being somewhere warmer.
It's obnoxious. But I've got all my return flights booked. So I'm excited to get home to the comfortable 90-degree heat, which is kind of where I like to reside. Anyways, so quick reminder, we're a live show Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Okay. You can tell because we say dumb shit and it doesn't get cut out. And also shout out to Krypton.
Oh, nice.
One of my favorite merches. It's again one of those like thin, super soft cotton shirts. Love it. Big fan. Krypton. Love Krypton. Check them out if you haven't heard of them. Yeah. All right. Well, let's play our little song and get freaking going then. What do you think? Should we do that?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Let's do it. Oops. Let's go.
When this show is in history textbooks, as I'm sure it will be, everyone will know that we are not youthful based on how hard we find it to play a video online.
This video. Yeah. This is before computers, like just for historical context, this is before computers can read your thoughts and do what you're thinking. Yeah, we actually have to physically. It's crazy. We have to physically do it. Can you imagine? Remember that time back in the day when your phone was connected to the wall? How crazy was that? I was telling my kids about that the other day, and they're like, "Oh, what?"
Yeah. Did you ever buy the longer cord to plug in so you can
it reminds you know that show Roseanne back in the day. That's what that long cord reminds me of because they had that phone in the kitchen. That always. Anyways, all right. Let's kick it off. Let's first talk about our friend Javier Milei.
Okay, so basically what's going on is it sounds as though he has made a final round, and the system that they're using is now being called, I think they called it a runoff vote, which is essentially where there's an elimination after each round. And so it's just him and another candidate, and they're quite opposite sides of the spectrum as far as I was able to find. So Sergio Massa is the established candidate. So he's the one who has a very different vision for the country's future, whereas Javier is much more about, prosperity, letting people do the things they want to do.
So this is a little bit different than what the system is in Canada and in the US. So in Argentina, as far as I understand, as far as I could read, they have something very similar to Canada in the sense that you can have multiple parties, multiple candidates. But what happens, and this happens occasionally in the US, where you get like a third independent candidate, if nobody gets a majority of the votes, then they take whoever the leaders were and do a runoff. So that somebody gets a majority. It happens often in Senate races in America, where you get too many people running and nobody gets 50%. It happens a lot, actually. So anyways, this is pretty normal. I think it's interesting to see an outsider, a populist candidate, generally speaking, which is what I understand him to be, Javier Milei,
Yes.
a populist candidate. That's like kind of the thing globally right now. There's a lot of populist candidates that are getting elected. So it's interesting to see. I think obviously he's like super pro Bitcoin, and
so his whole campaign, like the focus is economic liberalization, fiscal responsibility, and Bitcoin adoption as a legal tender. And people are worried that it might upset the peso, like the Argentine peso, but also who cares as long as you can spend it, right?
Who gives a shit about the peso? It's worth nothing now compared to what, like, they had hyperinflation for years because of poor government decision making. And so like, I think this is generally what I talk a lot about, the pendulum, right? The pendulum always is swinging, and it almost always goes too far one direction. And just when you think society is done, it swings its way back and goes too far in the other direction. Doesn't matter which side you're on, it always goes too far. And I mean, this is just kind of the natural progression of things. I think there's a lot of decisions globally, economically, that have been made in the last couple of decades that have really put us in a bad spot. And I think it's now starting to trickle down. Not starting to, it's really impacting the average person. Like this is no longer affecting only the wealthy or only the most disadvantaged. This is affecting everybody almost globally, right? And so people are saying, wait a second, like, cool, I love all these social causes. I might be a liberal, but we still have to make sure that we can pay our bills and heat our house and feed our kids. So like, let's maybe make sure we do that. And then we'll talk about social stuff later. Not that it's either or, but I just think there's a lot of people that are kind of attracted to these populist candidates because they're just saying the things that we're all thinking. You know what I mean?
Well, also, okay, I've talked about this a little bit before, and it's kind of a joke. I talk about running for city council in my city, not because I think I would be a great city councilor. I'd be a terrible city councilor, but because I look at the city council and they don't represent me. I don't look like those people. They don't look like me. They don't look like my friends. They don't look like the people in my neighborhood. Where are the people who represent us, right? And so literally the campaign that I joke about running is that I wouldn't wear a suit, just a denim jacket. They wouldn't have to give me a downtown parking stall. And that's it, actually. And people love it. Oh, and I run office hours out of my garage. That's the three things that I talk about. And people love it. People flock to it because all they see is this like really unreachable group of people who don't represent them and aren't talking about issues they care about. And if you can just be a little bit more human.
That's politics in general. Like, right? That's the challenge that every major country is going through right now, is you get these bloated bureaucracies, regardless of whether it's conservative or liberal. You get bloated bureaucracies that are so unbelievably inefficient and become more and more disconnected from the population. So anyways, all of this to say, we could go into politics and that would be hilarious.
We'll talk about it the whole episode.
But you know, I think it's good to see, you know, and I think he's got a good shot. So
yeah, we'll see. I look forward to reporting on the outcome of that election. So in the same way where we're talking about crypto and how that might save different areas of LATAM from their overinflated fiat currency, of course, CBDCs are also being talked about. You might have noticed that we as people are not pro CBDC, but not everybody has that negative sentiment. I think a lot of people who have witnessed that overinflation and then the drop off and having their money not be worth anything internationally, they are interested in what other options are available for them.
Yeah, I think my impression of CBDCs versus people in some of these disadvantaged areas are probably vastly different. I see it as, I live in America, so it's easy for me to move money around relatively easy. It's relatively efficient. It's not very difficult. It's not insanely expensive. It's much more expensive. It's much less efficient than blockchain, than digital, but it's still functional for me. So I don't see a CBDC as like changing my world. All I see as CBDC doing is giving a hell of a lot of oversight and control to the central authorities. So, but
whereas the International Monetary Fund is reporting that it's becoming, the sentiment is higher in LATAM than in America.
Yeah, and for a ton of reasons. So if you're sitting in LATAM and your currency is the Argentinian peso, how do you say Argentinian? I don't know. Anyways, the Argentina peso, you know, if that's what your life savings and you're being paid in that currency, I mean, your ability to transfer it globally and all of that stuff is significantly lower than mine. So a CBDC would probably actually be a meaningful step up for those types of people, where they're not concerned about, like, their number one priority is not privacy and separation from the powers that be. It's rather survival and just being able to, like, feed their families, right? Like, the priorities
the Caribbean has been a really good case study in this and in possible adoption, especially if you think about rural communities and economic inclusion, because it forces them, if they want to run a CBDC, it forces them to ensure that that infrastructure exists for people to actually be able to use the CBDC. And so I think it was Dominican Republic had introduced a CBDC that has gone quite well.
What was it?
Remember, we talked about that quite some time ago.
Yeah. Where
was the sand dollar?
Yeah. Where was SBF? Bahamas.
Bahamas.
Yeah. Which is nice and close to where I live. So maybe we'll have to go over there and investigate one day. Gives me an excuse. Hey, I can write up a trip to the Bahamas. Yeah.
That's right. The digital Bahamian sand dollar. And so that one has gone super well and seen a lot of adoption, and people have been quite happy about it, and they're actually using it. But
so the thing that,
do you think that this is going to pit? Do you think this is going to pit crypto against CBDC in a way that we don't experience in North America?
I don't think so, because I mean, although CBDs are probably attractive to the current fiat currency, I think a lot of the problems in the current fiat currency are the same in a CBDC. The problem with their fiat currency is government mismanagement. That's why the currency is a disaster. So you make it a CBDC and give them that same control over monetary policy, which obviously they messed up in the first place, and you give them incredible oversight and control over everybody's finances and effectively a social credit system. I mean, in my opinion, it won't be a debate for very long. The countries that have strong economies, I think maybe have a greater argument for a CBDC, although it's never going to happen. Right. Example, United States. I mean, in the United States, we have a lot better protection of citizens, even though we could all make an argument that it's still not that good. It's a hell of a lot better probably than what happens in, say, Argentina or Colombia or Venezuela or these countries that are exploring this. And we also don't have, well, you could probably make an argument that the mismanagement in North America is also as bad as everywhere else. We just happen to have a bit better of an economy that's backstopping it. Nonetheless, I just don't see CBDCs being a meaningful alternative to what we currently have. It's more of the same with much worse options for us as a society, I think. So I'm not sure we'll see that like pitting against, especially in these emerging markets, because I think you're going to find right away that a CBDC is not going to be adopted because it's more of the same. It's not a solution to their current problem.
And it's interesting to note that LATAM is picking up steam in terms of crypto. So in 2022, they only had 9% of the global crypto value, which I mean is still quite a lot considering that it's pretty new to them. But that's a 40% year over year growth of their interest and adoption of crypto in just 1 year. So definitely picking up steam, and Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico are at the top of that crypto revolution. Mexico is leading in terms of decentralized, and then other LATAM countries are more interested in centralized exchanges, probably because they're really just trying to circumvent that peso rate. Yeah,
I think Mexico was not really on my radar for crypto until a few weeks ago. And there's like 3 or 4 projects that we've talked to now that's actually their where their corporate domicile is in Mexico. A couple of them have offices in Mexico City, and so I obviously asked why, and the answer was you'd be surprised at how forward and how collaborative the regulatory regime is in Mexico. They're trying to offer a new market to both their citizens and to investment and immigration. So I think we'll have to definitely keep an eye on Mexico and LATAM from a
So Argentina is leading in terms of crypto in LATAM. So they have 85.4 billion in transaction volume this year. As you already said, Mexico is kind of that hub for business, if you will. And Venezuela prefers centralized exchanges. In fact, 92.5% of their volume is on centralized instead of decentralized. I just think this is kind of interesting to note how people are using it, because that gives us some insight into why they're using it. But we're also seeing more companies expand into LATAM, like Ramp. Binance was on our radar, I think about a month ago, expanding into Argentina, and Bitfinex, which is also a fairly sizable group. But we have El Salvador, who, you know, promises a Bitcoin city and isn't quite getting there. But we also have Bolivia, who's completely banned crypto. So I think there's still quite a dichotomy considering what a large landmass it is.
Yeah, I think, you know, looking at the centralized exchange versus decentralized exchange volumes, I think I give this a lot of thought. Why have we not seen mass adoption of the decentralized? Why is everybody not drinking the Kool-Aid of decentralization, transparency, autonomy, being that disruptive? Why aren't? And the reason is the general populace, especially in developed Western countries, expects consumer protection. They expect to not have to think. The government's going to protect us. They're going to keep us out of trouble here. And so I think people just like the comfort of there's someone to call. There's a place to go. There's someone who's responsible if you lose your password or need accounting forms or something. And so especially in emerging markets, I mean, those people in many cases have very little consumer protection. So anyways, it'll be interesting to see. I think people flock to where they feel more comfort, where it's a little bit simpler and a little less individual responsibility.
Say ease of use. Like it's almost like Maslow's hierarchy, but applied to finances, right?
Yeah.
When you're at a certain level and you feel that, you know, you want to explore finance further, you might think that things like transparency or general decentralized ethos is more important to you. Whereas if you're literally just trying to pay your neighbor without trying to deal with the government or your fiat, then why not just use a centralized exchange they're already on? Right?
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously arguments to be made for both sides.
Absolutely. But Venezuela prefers centralized exchanges by 92.5%, and Colombia is at 74% use of centralized exchange when you think sex versus tax.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I mean, it makes sense, honestly. Like, I think that's, if we've taken anything from the last cycle, at least the common theme that I keep taking is that we weren't ready for retail as a space because retail didn't come. We didn't get mass adoption last cycle. So what that tells me is there's still a big point of contention, I think, or a big piece of friction in that process. And I think it has to do with ease of use. And if it's the more divergent from the status quo, the harder it is for the average person to adopt, right? So if it's that much different than what they're used to at like Robinhood or TD Ameritrade or something, then it feels like a huge leap, you know?
Right.
And so hopefully, I mean, more and more people will start to take the middle step through centralized exchanges. I just hope that regulation happens fast enough so we don't have more of this FTX, Mt. Gox, other types of centralized exchange nonsense, a centralized actor nonsense. But yes, time will tell. Time will tell. Okay, where are we? Are we going to talk about El Salvador?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we weren't missing anything in the crypto divide, because there's a little bit more about Venezuela in there, but I don't think anything we haven't touched on. So let's talk about El Salvador.
Yeah.
Bitcoin economic rebirth. So El Salvador's vice president has basically said that the reason the country is doing so well is because they have embraced Bitcoin, but the citizens don't agree.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to kind of take this a little bit with a grain of salt, I think. Obviously, Argentina is embracing Bitcoin in a lot of ways to try to divert attention away from how poorly not Argentina, El Salvador, how poorly their economy is doing. It's a bit of I think it's a PR push. The country is really so small. Like I think I can't remember, they were buying like 1 or 2 Bitcoin a month or something. Like they're not buying like multiple billions of dollars of Bitcoin. They're just, pushing to try to have it be a legal tender, which it is in El Salvador, and which is obviously good for the space as a whole. But I mean,
they're trying to say that their GDP is higher, but I'm sure that's hard to measure if you aren't operating in your fiat. And the idea, of course, is that they have more tourism and more business tourism, but again, maybe difficult to prove.
I mean,
or attribute, I guess is my point.
Yeah, like you can say there's more tourism, there's more whatever. But I mean, COVID is done. Nobody was going. The
Also true.
motivation to travel to El Salvador during COVID was zero, generally, unless you had family there, which is not that many people. So
No, I think there's a lot of families there.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of families, but relative to other countries, I don't know how many families that need visiting. But all of that to say, I mean, I don't know. I hope that they can pull it together, but El Salvador is just not an economic hotbed. I mean, I don't see big companies moving to El Salvador. It's, for the longest time, was one of the most dangerous countries in Central America. It still might be. I don't know.
So,
I don't think I'd be running to El Salvador, but go ahead.
In El Salvador, do you remember the announcement of the Bitcoin city?
Mm-hmm.
What was the Bitcoin city actually going to do? What made it a Bitcoin city?
I don't remember specifically, but I think it had to do with, they were going to have a bunch of mining operations that were going to be part of the revenue of the city. And then everything in the city would be payable in Bitcoin. So like every store, everything would have to accept Bitcoin. At least that's what I understood.
Kind of cool. I don't know. I mean, if it's legal tender, that'll have to come anyways, but maybe it was supposed to be like the MVP of that.
Yeah, I think it was intended to be only Bitcoin. Like you had to use Bitcoin in the city, I think, just to try to show a contrast to the fiat system. I'm not certain of that, though.
Well, the people of El Salvador are bored and resentful that they haven't successfully built a Bitcoin city yet. And so El Zante, which is a town, has decided that they're going to do it themselves. And so they actually already opened a Bitcoin beach. A team of community leaders basically built the Bitcoin Beach initiative to test how everyone could get paid in Bitcoin. So the idea here is that they're going to have Bitcoin and not the traditional fiat at all. Yeah. And I don't know. I kind of like this. It looks like a beautiful place, and it's right on the coast, and it's near a couple of resorts. So they're
calling it Bitcoin Beach.
There. Well, so Bitcoin Beach is the MVP that they've already run, but now they're going to make the whole town of El Zante the Bitcoin city.
Oh, I assume Bitcoin Beach was still the. That's cool though. Okay,
they've already done Bitcoin Beach. Bitcoin Beach has been a success.
Was just the initial. Okay, yeah. I mean, again, this kind of comes back to what I said before. Like, I think obviously that the technology of Bitcoin is a stark contrast to what they're used to, because it's not manipulated by their country. There's not hyperinflation, generally speaking. There is a lot of volatility though, which I mean is obviously different than fiat in a lot of ways. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. There's some obvious gains in efficiency and cost savings, and there's some obvious additional risks. Maybe not completely additional. You remove some and add some, but nonetheless, yeah, I think it's really interesting. Hopefully, we'll see more of this. I don't think we'll ever see large scale Bitcoin only in the next decade type cities or anything like that. Like,
well, okay. So one of the things that I find really interesting about this is that El Salvador says, hey, we're going to have a crypto city where everything is payable in crypto. That's how it is. They never quite get there. And also, it's hard to get a lot of people to opt in. El Zante opts in on their own, right? They're here for it. They want to do it. They want to see it. This is kind of the opposite of what's happening in China, where China has said, we have a CBDC. And look at this industrial city that is very happily being the MVP for the CBDC. So instead of forcing people into running these Bitcoin cities or running their CBDC cities and trying a new form of payment, El Salvador is kind of letting towns do it themselves. Like, they're not going to step in and say, no, you can't do that, which is interesting too, because I mean, Bitcoin is legal tenders, but it's not the only legal tender. So for them to not accept a different legal tender could be detrimental unless they actually hope for the whole country to be Bitcoin only.
For the longest time, I thought if something was a legal tender, you had to accept it. In the U.S., you're as far as I understand, that's still the rule. If it's
I thought that was the rule too, but most places in the U.S., well, when I was there recently, they don't accept cash.
Exactly. There's a ton that don't accept cash, which I think it might actually be illegal. I'm not sure. But anyways, so we'll have to see how that plays out in some of these other countries.
This was like in Canada. Remember when there was a law about how many pennies you could use at a time?
No.
Yeah, it was like, I don't remember how many pennies it was, but it was in the hundreds of pennies. And so you could only pay for something, I think it was like under $5 with exclusively pennies.
That's
And so it's
hilarious.
technically legal tender, but it is also detrimental to the storefront if you pay for like, you know, your $100 purchase in pennies.
Buy a car in pennies. Actually, when I was a kid, there was a guy that lived down the highway from us, and his kids collected cans. They saved enough change from collecting cans to buy a car when they were 16.
No, they did not.
Yeah.
That's solid. I'm
It's
impressed.
crazy. That's a lot of cans.
All right.
I was like,
So-
how many cans do you have to save? Like, that's insane. Anyways,
just melted the cans down, poured it in a car mold. Anyway, this is LATAM. They love crypto.
LATAM loves crypto. That's the conclusion for today. LATAM loves
You
crypto.
should get that on your wall. LATAM loves crypto.
Yeah, maybe instead of enthusiasm. Which, if you watch the show all week, you'd understand the difference in backgrounds.
Because JD's so enthusiastic.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this kind of thing takes off, honestly. But we'll have to see. Change. This is the thing. We all sit around expecting some like very obvious, clear, and distinct inflection point. And that's never how societal change happens. It's kind of like the straws that eventually break the camel's back. But they need to stack up. And I mean, the idea that all of a sudden the whole world's just going to use Bitcoin and fiat's dead. I mean, that is never going to happen overnight. If that ever even does happen. If it ever does happen, it'll be over the course of decades, and we'll look back and be like, wow, that happened slowly, which is always the case. So seeing stuff like this is great. But again, don't have false expectations that all of a sudden your Canadian city is going to be Bitcoin only.
The other thing that I think is important here is showing that citizens are leading what they want.
It is cool
Which
because
is very much like Nigeria.
It's not the government forcing it on them. It's really them saying, hey, we want to opt into this. Opt-in versus mandatory requirements are much different. Yeah, much different.
All right, that's LATAM in a nutshell for the week. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Bitcoin a lot. So much Bitcoin.
Yeah. It's a Bitcoin day. Bitcoin. And we got to say FU to a couple people, I'm sure, because can't be Friday without FU.
That's true.
Probably just SDF and Gary Gensler. Anyways, reminder, we're a live show Monday to Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Like, share, subscribe. Help us get the word out, please. And we'll see you tomorrow. With that, I say to you, Kiara, go FUD yourself.
Go FUD yourself.
Later.